My name is Michael Grover. I am the Community Affairs Officer at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. For us, this is a dream come true for all of you to be here today to talk about kids and to talk about youth development. So the Minneapolis Fed, we have a lot of people, including some you'll hear from today, care passionately about this issue. And it's something that we are happy to bring to this conference. Before I say a few remarks to introduce our first panel, I would like to give you a little visual aid. So on each of your tables, excuse me, you have these cards. These are actually infographics that the Minneapolis Fed, in coordination with the Board of Governors, developed that provide key messages for the themes that Chair Yellen outlined today. In addition to being useful things that you can take home with you in terms of key facts that are coming out of the research papers, as well as the conversations with the plenaries, they have useful information on the back, such as the passcode for the Wi-Fi, as well as some Twitter information too. So these infographics are, we encourage you to take them with you. We also have them digitally too if you want to use them in your own work. That's something we'll certainly make available after the conference on our website for you to be able to download this information. So I'd like to kick off the first plenary discussion. Really excited today to have, or for this conference, because we have three excellent plenary sessions that we've planned for you. Our design in thinking about these plenaries was who are the rock stars, who are the academic rock stars in each of the different academic disciplines, be they economics, be they health, be they sociology, medicine, who that we can bring together to talk about these issues, to talk about these three main driving issues that Chair Yellen talked about, and share their kind of deep insights based upon their own research, based upon their own thoughts, but also looking at other research that's currently going on in the discipline that's going on out there. We've asked them to share really key results and ideas from their body of work today and throughout the conference. AJ Jones, who's the chief staff of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, will get us started. So take it away, AJ.
Wonderful, and good morning. Good morning, come on. This is Friday Eve, right? We should be excited about this. And more importantly, what could be more exciting than talking about the future of our children in this country, and specifically the future of our communities from one block to another. I am so excited to be here today to be able to introduce an incredible panel and to engage in a conversation that we've all been yearning to have. How best do we make this country better, and more importantly, more competitive? And that being said, I want to bring greetings from Battle Creek, Michigan. Yes, we are the place that makes breakfast work. And more importantly, I want to bring honor and applaud and acknowledgement from our CEO, Lejeune Montgomery-Tabron. I also want to thank the Federal Reserve System for putting this conference together, and more importantly, for inviting myself and others. We are honored to be here. I also want to acknowledge Chair Yellen's comments. They were wonderful and gracious, and more importantly, they gave us much to ponder and much to be inquisitive about as we move forward. I also want to acknowledge her stewardship of this economy, and more importantly, her leadership and the ability to move a conversation around equity that's so desperately needed. I also want to thank my good Federal Reserve colleagues, that being Eric, David, Michael, Alex, and so many others who did all the necessary work to pull us all here today. Without them, it would not be possible, and I think it's worthy that we should give them a round of applause for bringing us and making this possible. I also want to acknowledge the over 30-plus W.K. Kellogg grantees who are here today presenting. I am so impressed by both your commitment to this field and more importantly, your continual effort to advancing the conversation in this country on what direction we shall go with early childhood education. As I think about this conversation, I cannot leave without acknowledging one particular person, and that is Neil Kashkari, Federal Reserve head for Minnesota. I am so grateful, if you will, for his relationship and, more importantly, his thoughtfulness in being able to bring us all here today. For those of us in the Kellogg Foundation, we are often honored not only by the sacrifices that people make, but the shoulders that we stand on, who have made it possible to continue the conversation around equity and advancement of this country one day at a time. And I'm grateful for Neil's leadership and towards that effort. As the 5th largest foundation in the world, we have a unique position. The question is, when you have resources, what do you invest them in? For all intents and purposes, while we are not a business, we are making functional choices about the options of the future. What we choose to invest in also means what we choose not to invest in. And thus, as we think about where our legacy shall lie, we follow our words of our great leader and founder of our foundation, who spoke very specifically that he knew at the beginning of all that we do that we must ensure that we create a society where all children thrive. And thus, our investments have always been centered around and lined up towards our ability to ensure that early child education experiences are robust, strong, equitable, enlightened, and thoughtful to the contours of the current challenges of the day. As one thinks about these efforts, I am reminded, if you will, of a quote. Yes, given in a different context, but relevant and applicable to today. In 2010, at that time, the head of PIMCO, Mohammed Al-Aryan, had spoke about this idea of the new normal. And he was describing, if you will, how the financial crisis wasn't just a mere flesh wound or a mere bump in the road, but it actually had cut deep to the bone, if you will, of our American society, and more importantly, to our financial infrastructure. In many respects, our inability to not have a robust, functional, equitable, and just education system that ensures that early child education is first and foremost is not simply, my friends, a minor drag on our economy. It is effectively cutting at the bone of our competitive advantage and our economic vitality. Towards that, I am so grateful today to be joined by an expert panel who is going to engage us, if you will, not on the conceptual ideas of what potentially could be possible, but the real ideas of what happens when possible is put in motion. I say that to say the best is yet to come. With that being said, I wish to kick off the panel with our good friend and colleague from the University of Wisconsin, Katherine. After her, you will hear from my good friend Jack from Harvard, and then at the end, bring it all home, will be Arthur from the University of Minnesota. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I have to first thank the Federal Reserve here in DC and Minnesota. Frankly, there is no room that I think is better to have this conversation than this room. One that's bringing together people who are on the ground working with families and children, one that includes economists that think hard about how to grow the economy, and a room that thinks hard about how to grow children to become productive workers. And I hope our panel is going to engage in that conversation. We were each given about 15 minutes to talk. I'm going to take 1 minute to ask where the clicker is, because there's something here, but it doesn't. Is this the clicker? Yes. Okay. And then I'll make a racket-busting joke about Wisconsin, so you all can laugh about that. And then I'm going to jump right in, because we don't have a lot of time, and there's a lot to discuss in this field. I'm sort of teeing up sort of what we know about child development in the field of early childhood intervention. And then Art and Jack are going to follow with some new innovative ideas. There we go. I think one of the most important insights that's come out of the field is the notion that development starts very early in life. In fact, it starts in utero. And so the key skills, capacity, neural networks, socio-emotional systems, stress response systems that people need to be healthy, to be productive later in life, begin developing very early. certainly within the first 5 years, and frankly, much of that development happens in the first year and in utero. It's just important to understand that kids don't walk into our K-12 system as blank slates ready to learn everything. The development and the early learning has already begun, and it begins very, very early in utero. Where am I clicking this to? That's the other question. There we go. The other key insight, and this is frankly not new, we thought about this a lot in 1965 when Head Start was started, when we began the war on poverty and started targeting programs for children, is the fact that those skills and those capacities that children are developing early in life are deeply intertwined with their experiences. They're shaped by their experiences. And by way of shorthand, you can boil this down into 2 buckets of experiences that we think are particularly important for young children. One is enrichment. So it's the notion that children learn from experiences in their environment, from engaging with their environment, and not all environments are equally engaging and enriching. Children hear drastically different amounts of language, complexity of language, numeracy, based on what is in their built environment, and in particular, their caregivers around them. So we know that having a responsive caregiver who doesn't just answer a question with a directive, but that follows up with additional questions. When you read a book and a kid doesn't understand one of the words, do you stop and ask if the child understands the word and then explain what the word means? Do you use that word again the next day, the next week, and remind the child what it means? All of that interaction is what builds the language, skills, capacity, and the thinking that children need to have strong foundations for the later learning, for that later algebra they're going to take when they get to high school and college. It starts that early with the ability to build up those early language and executive functioning skills. The other thing we know, and I think Jack will touch on this much more, is the importance of protecting children from harm. When children experience stress, and I say that for some audiences that makes a lot of sense, other audiences are like, what do you mean children experience stress? Children experience stress, and they experience it physiologically, and when they experience it physiologically, it has lasting implications for their development. It affects developing systems in a way that cues them up to have problems later in life with their stress response system and with their health. So we know that experiencing adverse events in early childhood is going to have long-term problems for development for many children, not all children. And that means that having caregivers who can buffer stress, getting children out of stressful environments is critical to building a foundation for learning, right? So now it's not just exposing children to more of their ABCs and more of their numbers, but it's also making sure that they don't experience the harm of the violence, the abuse, neglect, maltreatment that happen to be in many families. So those are the 2 important nuggets of what, there are many more, but they're boiling down 2 important nuggets of what children need early in life from conception to develop in a healthy way. The other thing we know is that income is strongly related to how children perform when they enter school. So here is data from 2 cohorts of kindergartners, 1998 and 2010. And what these are differences in their reading, math, achievement is the first 2 sets of bars, and then some behavioral aspects. So we have everything from approaches to learning, how independent, engaged are they in their learning, and then aggressive behavior and depressive or withdrawal behavior. And there's 2 points. The bars for reading and math are quite large, okay? So it's over a standard deviation. For those of you that don't walk and talk standard deviations, we equate this to over a year's difference in learning. So that means that kids in the bottom 20% of the income distribution, when they come from poor families, they walk in the door to kindergarten already more than a year behind their more affluent peers, okay? That's a big difference in the kindergarten years, and perhaps most important, it doesn't go away. That gap in achievement persists through, this is up to 8th grade, and what you want to look at, the bottom bar again is the bottom 20% to the bottom line. The top bar is the top 20%. It is a parallel track. And all of that leads myself and my colleagues to think that shrinking that gap is incredibly important. If they're going to be on parallel tracks in our K-12 system, we need to think about setting up those tracks differently before they walk in. The other point I'll make, I'm flipping back now, is that differences in behavior are not as large as the differences in reading and math. Okay? And I think sometimes that gets lost in the conversation. There's a lot of concern about children's behavior, which is very appropriate, but the differences by income in terms of their early literacy and early math skills far dwarf the differences in behavior. Now, I'm speaking to economists, so I don't have to tell you that differences in skills matter, or at least some of you are economists. Differences in skills really matter. They translate into far different rates of college graduation. And I think we all know that the economy has been radically changed, or it's slowly changed, it's been transformed, and the value of a college education, completing a four-year degree, is incredible compared to the loss of completing just a high school degree. It matters. These skills from kindergarten that end up foreshadowing how kids are going to do in high school, that ends up foreshadowing how they're going to do in college, translates all the way through into their earnings. Okay? So if we want productive communities, if we want healthy economy, we need to start thinking about how to shrink those skill differences early in childhood. And I would argue we want to do it by bringing up the bottom. I have no interest in keeping affluent children from performing well. I have every interest in making sure that low-income children can do better and learn more before they get to kindergarten. So how do we do that? I think one of the most well-understood mechanisms to do that is to think about early childhood education programs, public preschool programs, private preschool programs, good preschool programs. With colleagues Greg Duncan, Hiro Yoshikawa, and Holly Schindler, we looked at every evaluation, rigorous evaluations, so we threw out the really bad evaluations, that had been done between 1960 and 2007. And we looked at end-of-treatment impacts. So how are kids doing when the program ended or a few months after the program ended? And what we found is this graph. The bubbles represent an individual evaluation outcome. Again, it's in standard deviations, so all the way up to 1 would be about a year of kindergarten. And what you see is that on average, these programs produce demonstrable results. So it's about a 0.25 to 0.3 standard deviation increase. So 2 to 3 months of improved learning, if you're thinking about it in terms of a kindergarten year. There's a couple of studies that are very famous, well known, in part because they've been able to study kids at a much longer range, follow them into adulthood, so the peri-preschool and the abecedarian. Those look somewhat like outliers in that they had incredibly large effects. But I think the important take-home point is that almost all, not every, but almost all study is certainly in a moderate effect size range, and that's important. Why is that important to know? Because it suggests that even average early childhood programs, right? So not your peris, not your abecedarians, even average quality early childhood education programs produce demonstrable important results that will improve low-income children's achievement. Why is that important? Because despite all of the rhetoric of investment in children these days, there are still many, many children that do not have this opportunity. So here is a graph of rates of preschool enrollment for 3- and 4-year-olds. And you'll see that the bottom 3 lines represent the bottom 60% of the income, children from the bottom 60% of the income distribution. The red line, again, is the top income distribution. There are large gaps. Right? And there are many children, so the line is hitting about 50% of 3- and 4-year-olds from the bottom 60% of the income distribution are attending something like an average preschool program. We still have a long ways to go to get those children into programs, and even longer to go to get them into high-quality programs. I'm going to go quickly and put in a plug for 2 more programs since I'm running out of time. 2 other things that I hope are on everyone's mind. One is home visiting programs. A very small percentage of families get home visiting programs still. So my estimates suggest it's something around 25% of low-income families are visited by home visiting programs. We know that the transition into parenthood is an particularly crucial and opportune time to meet parents where they are and support them as parents, help them with problem solving, help them deal with problems that they're dealing with, and help support their children's development. It's crucial to think about how we increase the quality and the reach of these programs. And then finally, we need also to think about cash supports for parents. We know that when parents have more economic resources, again, this should be common sense to a room full of economists, they're better able to provide for their children. They are also less stressed, and they have more bandwidth in order to problem solve issues that come up in their own life. Economic supports, cash supports, come in lots of mechanisms. They come in actual cash supports like the EITC. They also come in the form of other subsidies, childcare subsidies, healthcare subsidies, and they're crucial to thinking about how low-income families can sustain and promote enrichment and protect their children from harm. This is a quick graph to illustrate that we know that a program such as the EITC actually does promote well-being around children. So you can look at expansions in the EITC and link it to increases both in kids' achievement, but also reductions in mothers, in particular, poor mental health, so increases in positive mental health. In conclusion, I hope you enjoyed that quick tour through what we know. It's critical to understand that early childhood, that birth to 5 period, is the foundation of what we all are looking forward to as that human capital development. The productive worker later in life starts in utero, and many of the foundational skills start to be built up in that 0 to 5 time period. We know that vulnerable children and families need a range of supports and experiences to thrive. There is no silver bullet. It needs a variety of programs available and supported in the community to help them enter school ready to learn. 3 that I think we have strong evidence about are early childhood education programs. And I'll say it again, even the average quality ones have a benefit for children. Home visiting programs and family economic support programs. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. This is a nice segue from Katherine's presentation to what I want to talk about, and I'm going to begin by saying that I absolutely agree with everything that Katherine said, and I want to take you in a different direction. And the engine for my direction is that we're living through an unbelievable revolution in biology and neuroscience, molecular biology, and that is giving us deeper insights into some of the things that Katherine touched on in terms of how experience gets into our body and affects our learning and our health and our behavior. And a field that's now, as Katherine said, about a half a century old, I think has to begin to use science not just to help people understand why what we're doing is so important, but to answer the question of where do we go next and how do we up the ante in what we're doing. So I want to talk with you. The emphasis here is on leveraging a rapidly moving science base beyond the program evaluation to generate fresh thinking and new ideas and new theories of change and new hypotheses about how we might raise the bar, and also to confront this persistent challenge that we have yet to achieve impact at scale, which is obviously the major goal here, because with all of the good demonstration projects that are real, and we've proved the concept, it's not a debate anymore about whether we can change trajectories, but the gaps at a population level have not really come down at all in a half a century, and in some cases they've increased, and we shouldn't be happy with that. So let me start with showing you again Katherine's slide about 47 years of programs, agree with the fact that we shouldn't be arguing anymore about whether we can move the needle, but to say, here's the challenge. The mean effect over a half a century, the effect size has been about the same. If it looks like it's dipping down, a lot of it is explained by the fact that the counterfactual has changed. In the early days, the no treatment control group didn't get anything, and there are so many programs now that these are probably underestimates because people who are not in the program being studied are getting something else. But we look at these data and say, yes, we've proved we make a difference, but as a person who spent my life in this field, I look at this now with loving, constructive dissatisfaction with a magnitude of the impact we're having and say, so now what? And so I'm going to play my pediatric card. I'm a pediatrician by training. I haven't been in pediatrics for quite a while. But I want to use as an example a comparison of 50 years of treatment of the most common form of cancer in children and see if there's a lesson to be learned here. These are the data on the 5-year survival rates for acute lymphoblastic leukemia, the most common form of cancer in children. In 1965, when Head Start began, the 5-year survival rate was about 3%. It was a uniformly fatal disease. There was nothing we could do to keep children alive for 5 years. And by the way, I'm not comparing cancer to poverty, but I'm comparing the issue of how we approach very complex problems. 10 years later, the survival rate was 60%. If we made this kind of progress in early childhood, a lot of people would be declaring victory along the way, but it kept going. Today, the survival rate's about 95%, 96%. And how did that happen? And what's the difference between these two curves, and what can we learn from 2 half-centuries? So here's my suggestion about the lessons to be learned, and then I want to show you how our thinking can be applied to how's this going to get back to human capital development? Well, stay tuned, just one more slide. So the first thing is that in the beginning, in both cases, we drew on the best science that we had. Head Start, home visiting programs, all of those programs were built on a very strong science base that with this essential concepts has held well for 50 years. But what happened in leukemia, obviously it's easier to measure outcomes and not argue when it's a life or death situation, was people dug deeper and deeper into the underlying science of understanding the disease and used that as a way to drive hypotheses about different kinds of treatments based on the causes and how the disease evolves that would help us be better. And so things were tried and things failed, and some things were tried and they looked promising, and some things were put together in a way that produced a bigger impact than either one alone. And in many cases, the progress was kind of slow, and in some cases it was a step back, but there was this relentless pursuit driven by science of continuing to test new ideas and not just modifications of the best treatment at the time. Also, at any point in time, most of the resources went into providing early identification and state-of-the-art treatment for children with the condition. But there was some small but important part of the investment that went into the back room and said to people, find out something better. And don't leave us 5 years, 10 years, 20 years doing the same thing. And so this using science to drive new understandings, new thinking, and a relentless pursuit for better and better is an important lesson. And the other thing is, we know now, when in 1965, leukemia was seen as one disease. What we've learned over the years, at the time of diagnosis, you figure out which of the half a dozen different types of leukemia did you have, because we can match treatments to different subtypes. If there are half a dozen subtypes of leukemia, why are we still looking for the one program for kids in poverty? That doesn't make a lot of sense. So by using this kind of thinking without oversimplifying the analogy, let me tell you now, I'm not going to present data on what we found because we haven't found it yet. I want to present data on how we're thinking and how we're trying to drive a dimension of the field that cannot settle for just incremental change. So the first issue, and I'm going to really pick on some of the themes that Katherine teed up very nicely, 21st century science, which is a rapidly moving frontier in neurobiology and molecular biology and genomics and epigenetics, is actually giving us some very new ideas that are very promising about how we should think about the way we approach early childhood development. The first, as Katherine said, and I'm going to just add a little tweak to this, attention to development has to begin at birth and actually prenatally, and it can't start at age 4 or 5. Yes, pre-K for 4-year-olds is better than starting at age 5. There's no question about that. But it is not, and it also is earlier, but it is not remotely early when it comes to the development of the brain. It's not remotely early when it comes to the development of metabolic regulatory systems, the origins of the immune response. All of these things actually are influenced by environmental factors in pregnancy, as Katherine said. Actually, the relative risk of a pregnancy and the outcome begins with the health of a woman the day she becomes pregnant. And a lot of these things that affect learning, brain development, and health get embedded early in biological systems that are reading the environment and trying to prepare for optimal adaptation. And if the message is the environment is dangerous, the environment is threatening, the environment can be harmful to you, systems are developed well before age 4 to kind of be geared up for that kind of expectation. The second issue is that early experiences affect lifelong health, not just learning. We have to stop thinking about early childhood as just an education issue. This should not just be the province of the education budgets, the education committees. This is as much about the early roots of the budget busters in the healthcare system as it is about readiness to succeed in school, because all of the big ticket items that a healthcare system is focusing on are at higher prevalence among disadvantaged populations and individuals who experience stress. I'm talking about cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, depression, substance abuse, the whole 9 yards. They all are disproportionately distributed across the population. Art's going to talk about return on investment. We haven't even begun to build in the healthcare return on investment costs. That will kind of even make incarceration look like it's relatively inexpensive. The third issue, and again, I thank Katherine for teeing this up, is that healthy development requires protection for the developing brain, not just enrichment for the developing mind. It requires protection for the developing cardiovascular system. The extent that excessive stress disrupts brain circuits related to attention and learning, it accelerates insulin resistance and makes it more likely to get diabetes. It accelerates atherosclerosis and makes it more likely you're going to get heart disease. This requirement for not just providing enriched learning experiences, but protecting the developing biological systems is a critical piece of the new insights into how to build stronger foundations for human capital. So what do we do about that? The rest of my presentation, my brief remarks, is not just to describe what we know, but the much tougher problem, which is how do we take what we know and change what we do in our policies and our practices? That's, as hard as it is to figure out the causal mechanisms, that's not the promised land. It's okay, so how do we translate that into action? Right, so here's where the science is taking us. It's not an ideological perspective, and it's not just based on experience, but it actually is nice when science brings you to the same place that practical experience and what your grandmother could have told you. You're really onto something big. So here's kind of where we feel is some of the new directions about how we can think about this. If we want to achieve much bigger outcomes for children, much stronger reductions in disparities, then we have to start paying more attention, not primarily or only to the children, but to the adults and the communities in which they live in the following way. And I'm not just going to put this out as rhetoric, but explain the logic. We have to support the adults who care for children in building the capabilities they need to change their own lives, which is having a huge effect on their kids' future. And we also have to focus on building capacity of communities, not just in a generic sense. And I tip my hat to the Fed and many of you in the audience, who have been really that wonderful book about what works, to kind of tell us what do we know about community influences. But we need a deeper understanding in terms of what to do differently in communities. What is it about communities that affect children's health and learning outcomes? And it gets us to this notion of how do communities help buffer parents and families from stresses that kind of get transmitted into their ability or inability to provide a good learning and developing environment for their kids. So here's what this looks like. These capabilities, and I'm going to introduce you to the idea that we should stop thinking about parenting skills and workforce development skills and the foundations of being a successful adult and the so-called 21st century skills, although I think a lot of them you needed in the 20th, 18th, and 17th century as well, is that it's not about these different skill sets. What the science is telling us, there are foundational capabilities that are the building blocks of all of these things that it means to be a successful adult. What does it mean to be a successful, what do you need to be a successful parent, to be a successful worker, to be a successful member of a community and not end up in prison? There's a very strong science base on this area of what are called executive function and self-regulation skills. If I start to list them to you, you'll recognize how critical they are for economic productivity. The ability to focus and sustain your attention, the ability to set goals, make plans, monitor actions, change course, go to plan B if things aren't working, make decisions, solve problems, follow rules, control your impulses, delay gratification. We know where the circuitry is for all these skills in the brain. We know where the circuitry is, we know how it develops, we know how experiences can affect that to make them stronger or weaker, and these are the foundational skills for human capital development. So what do we do about that? Once again, so great, this is wonderful, we have all this new knowledge. How does this affect the way we think about programs? How does it affect, and I'm going to try to make a link for you now to show that early childhood programs and youth development programs need to be thought of on a single science base. These are not two fields competing for funding. Here's the developmental trajectory for executive function skills. It's the part of the brain that takes the longest to mature. It's the part of the brain that's the most different from all other animals. It's the part of the brain that is what makes us unique as a species. So the first thing is, it takes a long time to develop these skills. The second thing is that it begins very early in infancy with selective attention. There are differences in children's ability to focus their attention in the first 6 months of life based on how chaotic or predictable the environment is in which they're living. Makes sense, right? But you see there's this dramatic acceleration of these executive function skills from age 3 to age 5. This is the most rapid period of the circuit development and the skill development. We've got hard science for that, and your grandmother could have told you that, and a kindergarten teacher can tell you that, because if you ask what's the difference between a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, a 5-year-old can pay attention longer, can sit still better, can control impulses better, can follow directions better, can understand Simon Says, and a 3-year-old can't. So this is a considerably rapid period, and it's foundational. As Katherine said, you don't start fresh at 5, you build on what happened in that 3 to 5 year period. But Mother Nature is telling us, I'm going to give you another shot. There's a period from age 15 to 25 to 30 years where there's another acceleration of a higher level of these executive function skills. This is what people talk about when they talk about the adolescent and young adult brain and how that's changing. So we have, the message here is, get your act together in the first 3 to 5 years of life, and don't start at age 4, and don't even start at age 3, because important things are happening and you can't go back and rewire. But if you don't get it right, then I'm going to give you another shot, 15 to 25 to 30, where you have youth development and a lot of young parents, and say there's another period of optimal plasticity, but you don't learn these skills by being given an instruction sheet or sitting in a classroom. You learn them through coaching and practice. And if you're on a weak foundation, the coaching and the practice has to be more intense. It costs more money, but it's a window. It's a window. And in the early childhood field, we're mostly giving people information and advice, not helping build their skills. So the last thing I want to leave you with is how we evaluate programs. The name of the game in development is variation. It's not, so you have these social class gradients, but it's the scatter that's most important. The way we determine the criteria for evidence-based programs right now is we do, and Katherine showed some wonderful data. We look at any intervention and we look at the mean difference between the treatment and control group, and if it achieves significant difference, we call it an evidence-based program. That's holding us back. What we need to be asking is, why did it work so well for these kids and families? Why did it work so poorly for these others? We should be replicating and scaling programs that are effective for some part of the population and go back to the drawing board and figure out what to do for the part of the population that's not benefiting. If we did what we do now with leukemia, we'd still be getting lower average effects, and we wouldn't be helping the variability within the problem. The goal here is a suite of interventions matched to differences with different strategies to respond to the difference of resources and needs and objectives. So I want to leave you with this last thought. Any healthy field has a distribution of investment. Using early childhood as an example, we have part of the field that really is struggling with quality. We need to invest in good quality programs. We have a part of the field that's providing good meeting basic standards. We need to increase access to those programs. We have a part of the field that's state-of-the-art, and we need to have everybody aspire to that and move toward that, and that's where most of the investment goes. But this field is missing the R&D dimension. There's no significant investment in the generation and testing of new ideas and the early adaptation, which is what all healthy fields have. So that's the challenge here, is to build on 50 years of demonstrated effects that Katherine is talking about, but say we are not going to get to impacts at scale, and we're not going to increase magnitude unless we start using the science to develop and test some new strategies. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Good morning. Kind of feel like a homecoming for me. 40 years at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, 25 years as Director of Research. I tell people I used to worry about banks. Now I worry about babies, from too big to fail to too small to fail. So how does a Director of Research get involved? A Director of Research who studies business cycles and inflation and unemployment, et cetera, how do they get involved in early childhood education? Well, it's a long story, and I don't have time for that. But just to keep it short, a former governor of the state of Minnesota and a former mayor of Minneapolis asked Rob Grunwald and I to take an economic look at early childhood education. So that was over 15 years ago. We started by examining in longitudinal studies like Perry Preschool and concluded that investing in high-quality early education is the best public investment we can make. Now, in Minnesota, I wasn't too far out on a limb there because we were in the process of spending close to $1 billion on sports stadiums. I knew we could beat that return. Indeed, based on Perry, we found, when we looked at the rate of return, we found an 18% inflation-adjusted return. Actually, it was so high, it was a little embarrassing. We sent it to James Heckman, Nobel laureate at the University of Chicago, to double-check our results. A few months later, he comes back with 18% on our results, so we were pretty confident. This morning, I want to review and sort of bring you up to date on that result. I find, if anything, the research since then supports this notion that we can get a very high return, a double-digit return from high-quality early childhood education focused on our most vulnerable children. But I'm not going to leave you there. As suggested this morning, we know an awful lot. In fact, I would argue that the research is overwhelming that we know that we're underinvesting in high-quality early education for our most vulnerable kids. But how do you take this research and take it to the real world? How do you actually make it happen? So the second part of my presentation will talk about the Minnesota model for early childhood development. And just because I don't have a lot of time, I want to make it clear what that model is. We call it market-based, parent-focused, or market-parent-based focused approach to early childhood education. It's a very simple idea. It's scholarships. It's scholarships that empower parents to send their child to a high-quality early childhood program. It has to be high quality. And the full scholarship includes funding for home visiting nurses starting prenatal. As we heard, early childhood development is not kindergarten. It's not 4-year-olds. The science is clear. It starts at the very beginning. So our mentors, and again, there's a lot of research behind this, starts prenatal when we can with our children. So that's the Minnesota model of education, which I will conclude with. Let's see, how do we, the green one. Yeah, what's that? Aim it. This one, that one, thank you. So this is the Perry Preschool. These are the results. Not going to surprise many of you in the audience. It's a pretty famous study. We have some program costs, and we have some benefits. And the benefits include significant benefits for K through 12, as a child is less likely in the Perry Preschool experiment to be retained. Remember what Perry Preschool is, if you don't know. It was a high-quality early childhood program that started in the early 60s. It was 2.5 hours a day, 5 days a week, all day. There were lots of home visits, so there was 1.5 home visits a week. It was parent-focused, okay? And there was 123 families, randomized, controlled. So the methodology doesn't get much better. We find significant benefits in the K through 12 system because the child is less likely to be retained, less likely to need special ed. We have significant long-term, we have 30, 40 years of data on peri-preschool, long-term earnings. Crime rate went down significantly, and of course the reduction in the cost to victims. So peri-preschool is sort of the classic example of what potentially we can do with a high-quality early ed program. I'm going to argue that was 40, 50 years ago. We've gotten a lot better. And by the way, the population, if you look at crime statistics, they're up significantly since then. So I think we're way under, that 18% actually inflation-adjusted return is an underestimate of what we can get. But we looked at the return on this investment, and where we started is peri-preschool, and we found benefit cost ratios of 16 to 1. Heckman found 7 to 1, 12 to 1. It very depended on certain assumptions. We went to other studies. Abecedarian has been mentioned, and there we found 4 to 1, 7 to 1 ratios. The Chicago Child Parent Center studies, 4 independent longitudinal studies, and we found significant benefit to cost ratios that were quite high. Now, when Rob and I looked at that, we also found a very high benefit to cost ratio. There's a problem with that number. I remember I was in the president of the Minneapolis Fed, Gary Stern's office, showing him that number, and I realized when you look at a benefit cost ratio, you need other projects to compare it to. It looks high, but what if we invested in more prisons? What if we invested more in higher education or K through 12? What were those benefit cost ratios? We didn't have data on that. So we needed to take the benefit cost ratio data and convert it into an internal rate of return. And fortunately, the assumptions were right. So we took the formula, put the benefit data, the cost data, and that's when we calculated a rate of return, an annual rate of return, inflation adjusted. And that return, we found the total rate of return was somewhere between 16 and 18%. The public return on that, the public return, most of the return was to the public because, again, the public schools were benefiting, there was less crime, and less crime was huge. There were benefits to higher income means that there was fewer kids on welfare, more productivity, so there's a significant amount of public benefit. And I want to stress the public benefit because if we're going to go to the public and ask for significant dollars for early childhood education, we're arguing this, as I said, is the best public return. So now we have a number that we can compare to the stock market, for example. We kind of view that as our hurdle. Post-World War II stock market was something like 5.8% inflation-adjusted annual return. So if we could beat 5.8%, we could go to the public and say, we've got a better return. So taking money out of the market and putting into this investment, this was that was the bottom line. That's why we argued we've got a much better public investment than stadiums, if you will. Heckman went on to find returns of 7 to 13%. More recently, Heckman has gone back in Abecedarian and found significant health benefits. We're starting to scratch the surface. And as Jack said, once we get into the health aspects of early childhood education, we're going to find that this 18%, again, is lowballing it. My wife's an epidemiologist. Our paper for this conference summarizes much of this research. And it's clear from the epidemiologist's point of view, early education is as much about health as it is about education. So, but it raises challenges. Jack was getting at some of these challenges. Challenges to how do you take this to scale? Remember, I said I wasn't going to just leave you with all we know. We know an awful amount what we can do to improve early childhood education and make sure all our kids succeed. But how do you make it work? Well, here are the principles, or I'll say the challenges. You have to start early. So whatever program we're going to come up with, whatever public policy, it better start early. Target most vulnerable, we call these our high return children. That's where the investment is. Once you get a middle class and above, the return is very low if it doesn't even pass a benefit cost test. Engage and empower parents, I've already mentioned that. I don't think you can get these long-term results without an engaged and empowered parent. It's critical to focus, as Jack said, on science of the adult behavior. So the parents are critical here. Our policy is not just simply taking a child and putting him in a center-based program. It's much more than that, as I'll talk in a few minutes. Assess and improve quality. It's got to be about quality. You can't just put your child in a child care program and set them in front of the TV or whatever. It's got to be a quality program. Flexible and culturally sensitive. I'll get to that issue a little bit later. And we need in this country a long-term commitment. You're not going to get these results if we don't have a long-term funding commitment to early childhood education. Okay, so how do we do this? What's the Minnesota model? As I mentioned, the Minnesota model was fairly simple. Scholarships, full scholarships. I was fortunate, and the CEO of Cargill and the CEO of Target and the CEO of Ecolab bought these ideas. They said to me, Rolnick, let's get you out of that ivory tower at the Minneapolis Fed, and let's see if it'll work in the real world. And we created a nonprofit called the Minnesota Early Learning Foundation. We raised $20 million privately to do our first pilot in St. Paul. We started with about 650 families. Again, we start early as prenatal because there were full scholarships, so our parents, if we got to them early enough, we started prenatal. The scholarships were awarded to low income. Notice they were targeted. The scholarships could only be used at high quality rating programs. We created with part of that 20 million, we created a rating system we call Parent Aware. Okay, so the scholarships can only be used at high quality. The rated programs can be center-based, they can be public, they can be private, or non-for-profit. One size, Jack kind of got into this, Katherine got into this a bit. One size does not fit all. We were using all hands on deck, let the parents figure out what program works best for their child. So that was the Minnesota model in theory. And now with this 20 million, about half of it went to our first pilot, which was in St. Paul. And let's see if I can get this going again. Scholarship generally available to ages 3 and 4, earlier for children with higher risk factors, and the mentors were there prenatal. So this was the pamphlet we handed out. How do you get a program started like this? Not so easy. We had to go door to door with these pamphlets offering early childhood scholarship programs. We worked with the mayor of St. Paul, and his staff went knocking on doors, had trouble at first, but once the word got out that we were the good guys, we ran out of money. So our critics who said, you know, these parents somewhat not engaged, they won't use these scholarships. Every scholarship virtually was used except for a few parents who moved out of town. The evaluation on this program, children showed significant increases in language, literacy, early math skills ranging from small to large effects. Number of high quality providers increased. Let me say this again, many critics here said this isn't going to work because in the area that we picked, which was a low-income area in St. Paul known as Frogtown, there were no 3-4-star rated programs. Well, within 6 months, once the word got out that all these parents had scholarships, paying up to $13,000 a year, Montessori expanded their program, St. Paul School expanded theirs. New Horizon opened up a brand new facility in this community. It was the best economic development they had in years. They hired people from the community. They were on a bus line, so it was fairly easy to get to. They created current jobs and, of course, future jobs. Finally, over 80% of the interviewed parents talked with child teachers about behavior, accomplishments, and home-based activities. Let me give you one anecdote from this. We did focus groups with our parents. Many of these parents hadn't graduated high school. We asked them, what did you think of this program? What did you think of the scholarships? Couldn't say enough good things. What did you think about your parent mentors? Couldn't say enough good things. An awful lot of bonding went on between the parent and the mentor. What problems did you have, if any? Their biggest concern was, is K through 3 going to be 3-4-star rated? So here we had parents who are now worried and concerned and are going to be engaged in their public school system. I'm going to argue with that kind of involvement, we're going to get the long-term results. Obviously, we don't have them yet. Because of our success with the pilot, We received $11.4 million from the years 2012 to 2016 to expand these scholarships statewide. We call them transformation zones. We're doing it in North Minneapolis, and there's some amazing organizations there. There's an organization called Way to Grow that is basically following this model. Something like 90% of their kids start school ready. We got the Northside Achievement Zone, one of the promised neighborhoods, doing wraparound services in that neighborhood. We're also expanding on White Earth Reservation in northwest Minnesota, also starting to get incredible results. We're in a low-income rural area. We've got waiting lists for these scholarships in every one of these areas. I don't care where you live, I don't care your religion, I don't care the color of the child. Parents are parents everywhere. We're showing that this will work everywhere, and it is scalable. The four of us could probably run this program, bring it to scale in Minnesota, giving out scholarships and getting mentors into these families does not require a lot of bureaucracy. It is something that we're showing in Minnesota work, and it's worked very effectively. As we speak right now, we are lobbying, and we look like we're going to be very successful. 2 years ago, Minnesota legislature increased funding from $4 million in 2011 to $80 million in 2015, reaching over 8,000 children. We are now lobbying to double down. Our ultimate goal is every child born into poverty in Minnesota will have access to high-quality early education. Not 5 years from now, not 10 years from now. We have a model that's scalable, that is working. Now is the time to do it. We have much more to learn, I understand that. We're like a startup company, if you will. But I'll still get you double-digit returns. Eventually, we'll get all the kids succeeding, but I'll still get you double-digit returns with the Minnesota model. Thank you very much.
Well, that was a wonderful presentation. Can we give them a little round of applause, please? I was so encouraged with what was heard, and I'm sure you all were too as well. As we think about this conversation, I wanted to actually start with Arthur and then come back through with Jack and also with Katherine on this question. As we began the conversation, it was clear that we were bringing the evidence as related to the Perry School, and it kept flashing in my mind the question, are we going back to the future? And so in many respects, are we thinking about how we look at our early childhood engagements, not necessarily from the area of what needs to be done next, but looking back and saying, what did we learn and how do we apply what we learned? And I'd be curious to know, in this current day and age with kids being so different, yet at the same time being so similar, do we really know all that we need to know? And is it basically about an issue of applying it? I want to start with you, Arthur.
My mic on? Yeah. So as I concluded, no, there's much more to learn. And I think, as Jack was saying, we need more research and more innovation in the science and use the science in the field. But we need a system to take that science in and use it. And the approach that we're taking in Minnesota, where it's market-based, it's parent-focused, we are collecting data on these children, starting prenatal. We're showing that our kids are more likely to be born full weight, full term, less likely to be born addicted, that emotional IQ as well as cognitive IQ is improving, that kids are starting ready, and the parents are engaged. I think that, yeah, we still have a lot to learn. In particular, Perry was 3 and 4 year olds. It was starting too late. Mm-hmm. That was one of my early lessons from Jack way back when he pulled me aside and said, you know, Perry's great, but if you really want to get to the most vulnerable kids, you've got to start at the beginning. I remember I didn't understand what he said at the time. I was still studying business cycles. But it's clear we've learned so much about those earliest years, and it's critical as a policy that we adopt programs that fund support, if you will, tools for these parents starting as early as prenatal. So, no, we're not going back to the future. We really need to look forward, but I think we need to look forward in a system that's scalable and effective, and I think we've got one.
As we think about that system, Jack, I was moved by your thoughts in reference to doing the comparison between our investments that we made in cancer and if we had the same kind of investment in engagement, if you will, in early childhood development. In that, I was reminded of there was a great film not too long ago called The Emperor of All Modalities, which kind of traced, if you will, the history of how we engage ourselves in cancer. And I thought to myself, if we had that same kind of aptitude and engagement, what would the future look like?
Yeah, great question. So I think one issue here is the context that you set up, AJ. One of the things that's changed is that the early childhood field until the last 10 years, having been around for 40 years before that, operated in a siege mentality where there was no room to raise questions about anything because there was always this notion of, people are going to just pull the whole rug out from under us. Well, I think now there's much broader understanding that we're not going back to the past of saying, nothing much important happens early on. So, but the mindset to deal with this changed context has to change to bring together. It's why I love my history with art. We need to bring together the kind of warm-hearted child development approach and the hard-nosed economic approach and bring them together, not have them, kind of be fighting a battle to the death. So for me, going back, there's a going back to Perry, which basically says, let's look a little bit deeper at Perry, because we have to stop thinking about just the question of is it working or not. So Perry, and you said it, Art, Perry had once a week, at the least every other week, those highly trained teachers spent an hour at home with the mothers working on the things they were doing in the classroom. Maybe Perry was an intensive parent skill building program that happened to be attached to a center-based school. Maybe, I don't know. But the questions that we didn't ask in the past, and we have to be, and we're not asking a lot now, is not so much, does a program work, but like, what is the program? What exactly is it? And what about it is working and what about it isn't? For whom and in what context? And then we'll start making, kind of progress we want in the future by drawing on what we learned from the past as well. It's not, I think there are, a neuroscientist I work with says some of the most interesting questions he's looking at now are questions that were raised in papers published by neuroscientists 40 years ago, where they had insights into things like, this is an interesting question, we need to study this more, but they didn't have the tools or the knowledge to study it that we have now. Some of those best questions were raised a long time ago, so I think we need to do both.
As you say that, Jack, I think about Katherine and particularly her comments as she spoke about this issue around what I heard was the built environment and the environment in which children are born into, and the parents whom which will care for them, and the caregivers who will care for them too as well. And in that context, I was curious, Katherine, are you basically saying that place matters?
Yes, I am. And I'm also saying more than place matters, right? So I think part of the reason why it's not, that early childhood hasn't been the story of leukemia is that what we learn about what children need and how they develop is one piece of the puzzle, right? And the other piece is knowing what children need. How do we get the adults surrounding them to be able to provide what children need, right? So now it's not just about the science of development around children, it's about the science of human behavior and changing adults' behavior, right? And that sounds kind of crude to talk about changing adults' behavior, but it's now about, okay, I want the teachers and the home visitors and the staff to be providing and connecting and meeting people where they are and bringing them forward. How you do that is a very complicated enterprise, right? And you only have to look at what's even more depressing than enrollment levels is professional development systems within states and training within states and how you build policy systems that are taking into account all of the factors and moving people forward. And so I'm all in with Jack on the importance for pushing the frontier and doing more. And I think the best way to do it is to use the science of child development along with the science of adult change learning and push those forward for both parents and for providers, right? Because it's the home visitors who are out there trying to help the parents learn what they can do better. It's the frankly, the technical college systems that are training our early childhood providers, right? And so you have to think about it in a system way and push it forward that way. And the exciting thing is that now we're having that now that's the conversation that's on the ground. It's no longer, can I just give them, this program or that program in a summative way, it works, it doesn't work. But it's now about what is the system that's going to support quality delivery, that's going to think hard about how to actually make these changes in communities, in actual specific spaces and communities.
As you mentioned that, and I'm going to come back through, you talked specifically about this strong correlation as related to income and outcomes in terms of early childhood education. And you also mentioned the dynamic around the needing for a policy system to actually be thinking about these issues. And I'm reminded that oftentimes when we think about cash assistance, we get into issues of income disregards and usually a cacophony of policies that are unarticulated, if you will, in terms of the system, that really make it very difficult to think about how you look at asset orientation in terms of families in order to be able to better provide for education opportunities for their children. So I'd just be curious if you can pull that thread just a little bit more and your thoughts around that and as we move back over.
You're talking about the web of benefits that families face. So I think a clear example is with my colleagues Greg Duncan and Hiro Yoshikawa and Lisa Giannetti, and we're trying to partner to provide $4,000 a year to low-income families, study if that helps them develop their children. And we have had to go to states and pass legislation that says that this money will not be taken back in terms of public benefits. Because the minute that you start providing supports to family in terms of cash, unless it's through the tax system, through the EITC, they start to lose other benefits. And so, and the administrative burden of navigating these policy systems for a low-income family that needs help paying for childcare, that needs SNAP and food stamps, all of this creates a really complicated policy environment in which to act, and you can't simply give additional supports without worrying that others will be pulled out from under them, and you can't get kids in programs without worrying that they're going to lose benefits, which is why Art's program, right, which just thinks about here's the support, and doesn't think about what they're going to, is able to provide it without them losing something can be important. So absolutely, you can't, this notion that there's one program that's going to be disconnected from other programs and is going to make a big difference really has to think about integrated services across human services, education, medical, certainly, and other sectors. You can't take a siloed approach anymore. It's not going to work.
Which connects to your point, and then I'll come to you also.
So I want to build on that in terms of what do we know now that we didn't know before. And there's some dimensions here that remarkably we haven't mentioned at all yet, which is telling us something about kind of where the challenges are. Because it's not just poverty, and it's not just the availability of money. And we know much more now than we did when we started about the impact of violence, the impact of racism, the impact of substance abuse, on children's well-being. But more than that, we used to think that even if people understood that's a hard thing for a family, that when kids are young, they don't really know what's going on, and if they do, they don't remember it. And we know that that's not true. Not that even babies. It's not that they're analyzing, but they are experiencing the level of toxic stress as opposed to just normative stress. We all have stress in our lives. And that applies to upper income families as well that are struggling with problems, and their kids have more problems later. So I think this issue about getting deeper into understanding all of the forces, and we have talked, Art mentioned it, and Katherine mentioned it, helping parents build their skills has been a part of the field from the beginning, but I think we're understanding now it's not so much about changing people's behavior, it's about helping them change their own lives, right? And that's very different from saying we're going to come in and teach you how to be a parent. People are struggling and we focus just on parenting, they're struggling to keep food on the table. That is creating a very unhealthy environment for their kids. So when we start to get down to this level, everybody says, oh my God, it's so complicated, and you're telling us there's no simple answer. So I don't want to overplay the cancer analogy, but with this wonderful leukemia story, I have a very dear friend who died 2 years ago from pancreatic cancer, which we've made very little progress on in 50 years. I don't hear anybody saying, why are we still continuing to try to figure out how to treat pancreatic cancer? We've been trying for 50 years. When it's too complicated, let's stop investing. But so this is the issue about which part of the population is bearing the burden and which isn't, and Art's point about who we all pay at the end. The other thing we haven't said is that the most disadvantaged part of the population is basically not involved in the programs we have right now, are not engaged, the programs aren't addressing their needs, and the attrition rates are very high in some programs, and they're mostly families who have the greatest needs. And that's where, as Art said, the huge potential for payback is, and we need new ideas. We can't just say, why are people dropping out of programs?
As I transition to Art, I want to thank you for bringing up the issue around both the question around race and also immigrant status and other types of issues that we know that disproportionately impact equity opportunities. And I think it's unique to think about that market approach, because as I think about the issue in Minnesota, and particularly Minneapolis, with the hybridity of diversity in Minneapolis, and thinking about how do you create high quality educational systems and then bringing a business orientation to that, how key that is in order to be able to think about the future of the economy. So as you consider.
So I want to get into a political issue, and I'll differ a little with Jack on funding is a major part of this. And why do we see, I'll go back, I know I harp on this, why do we see in Minnesota $1 billion going in for sports stadiums, and we struggle to get 10 million, 50 million for early childhood education, and the research is so overwhelming? So my answer is, these kids don't vote. No, maybe in Chicago, I don't know if in Chicago, but in many, these kids don't vote. And the parents are not engaged in the political system for sure. So if you're a Minnesota Viking fan, if you've got lots of supporters out there, and we would go to many testify on this, you'd see all the support they would have, and yet for the low-income kids, for low-income family, it's a political struggle. I think Tim Bartek is going to be, maybe Tim is here, but Tim and I have done a lot of work on what we call the economic bidding war among the states, and where cities and states spend hundreds of millions of dollars, and Tim's estimated close to $50 billion a year in this country. Cities and states are trying to lure each other's businesses across state lines. From a national point of view, it's a zero return. You're just moving jobs around. Now, I understand locally why it's important, but it makes no sense. And we're spending $50 billion. You know what we could do with $50 billion for early childhood education? We would start to make the kind of progress Jack is insisting that we should be making, and that's saying we can be making, but money matters. And so I think we have to figure out a way through that political morass to speak for these kids, to speak for these families, to say, we can't afford as an economy, you can make a moral argument, but we can't afford as an economy to leave these many kids behind. I'm from Detroit. A number of years ago, front page of the Detroit News, 75% of the children in the Detroit public schools don't graduate or don't graduate on time. What do you think those kids are going to do in this economy 15, 20 years from now? And I said this at the White House, I don't care how much money you give to General Motors, if you don't educate those kids, that's going to be a third world economy. It almost is now. It will be 20 years from now if you don't educate all our kids.
And obviously, we concur with you at the Kellogg Foundation, as you rightfully know, being a Detroiter. We recently engaged with the city of Detroit to actually create what we call Hope Starts Here, focusing on how in the world do we create the best quality system for 80,000 kids who need early childhood education. So we concur with you in reference to that. But I think you hit on something, and hopefully I'm going to bring it to the rest of the panel as before we move into the broader discussion. And that is, you talked about the most vulnerable as being the high return opportunity. And that really is a narrative change quotient, to be able to speak about people not as being the most vulnerable, but actually that's our blue chip. Right? And if you could expand upon that, and then I ask my others to continue on that just a little bit too as well, and then we'll go out to the audience for questions.
Well, one of the things I've learned working with Jack is language matters a lot. And instead of, and then we looked at the economic case, and it was easy to take a look at the economic case and say, hey, from a business point of view, these are high return children. And I think that's a great marketing tool, if you will. Start thinking of our kids that way. I think the business people get it right away, and I think we're starting to make inroads into the political system, that this is the way. We have limited public dollars. What's the best way to invest them if you're looking at your economy, not just now, but into the future? And so language matters.
Jack, any other thoughts on that?
Well, I would say the quote, most vulnerable children are the children at great risk, are living in circumstances with very rare exceptions, with parents who are desperately wanting to do well by their kids as much as people who are the least vulnerable. And our early childhood approach, I think, will go a lot further not just from scientific reasoning, but from my conversations with people on the ground, is that the most vulnerable families resonate best when they're presented with a program. And the program begins by thinking about what those adults need in their lives to change things around. It's supposed to start with telling them about how they should read to their kids and talk to their kids and things like that. And so it's not just a careful choice of words. It's that we can't improve the lives of vulnerable kids independent of the adults who are caring for them. And we can't help people change their lives by just telling them what to do. We have to kind of help them change their lives in the way they want. And this issue of money and where's the money going to come from, there is a lot of money that we're also spending publicly in a separate way on workforce development programs and programs focused on adults who are struggling, and it's incidental that they happen to have kids. And we're spending money on programs for young kids, and it's kind of incidental that they have parents, because what we talk about is, let's have a parent group every once in a while. So if we thought more in terms of not just co-location, let's put those programs in the same building, but let's really conceptualize an investment in human capital development from one generation to the next by starting investing more in the human capital of the adults who are caring for young children. That includes the people who work in programs, the people who work in early childhood programs. Many of them are low-income women with limited education being paid very low wages. And they have high rates of depression and difficulty dealing with 15 kids whose behavior would challenge anybody, right? So it's rethinking how we use money we're spending.
That's wonderful. As I open up the conversation to invite the audience, I'm going to open up the conversation to invite the audience. I wanted to ask Katherine to also make a comment too as well. So, but please, those who want to ask questions, please make your way to the microphones too as well, so we can start.
And I just quickly wanted to comment, right? So not only is it not an either or, and I feel a little nervous saying this to a room of many economists, if not all, but I think we know why our economy grew as much as it did over the last 100 years. And one of the things that happened is the educational attainment of our workforce had expanded greatly. The other thing that happened is that women came into the workforce and the economy expanded. So if we are going to sustain women's participation in the workforce, if we are going to provide real opportunities for people to make a living in the current economy, we have got to figure out how to support them as parents and as workers, to give them the capacities and the skills they need to do both. So it's simply about, it's a community approach which focuses on children by supporting the parents to be good parents and good productive workers by providing the opportunities they need. And at some point in that, you have to deal with the transformation of the economy and how do you get people into the types of jobs that will sustain a family and help them be the good parents that they do want to be.
Excellent. Amen. I welcome a question from the audience here. Please announce yourself.
Hello, my name's Matt Singh. I'm with the Low Income Investment Fund, and we invest in child care facilities across the country. I have two questions, or I guess one question with two parts. How do you balance the need to focus on the most vulnerable populations and the high returns that you're talking about? One, with the research that's coming out now showing the benefit of having diverse classrooms, both in terms of racial composition and income composition of the students and families. And then also with the issues of gender equity and access to the workforce. So for instance, in New York City with the universal pre-K, one of the things that's addressed is how the affordability of childcare for middle class families is being addressed in that. So how do you balance those?
Such a simple question.
Let me comment on both. But the first part, if you look at our scholarship families and where they ended up choosing programs, we compared those programs that they chose. So they weren't told they had to go to Head Start. Some did. But they turned out to be much more diverse than the St. Paul Public School system. So we're claiming with empowering these parents to decide what they need for their child, whether it's language immersion, whether it's Montessori, whether it's St. Paul, whether it's a faith-based program, whatever, that they end up in a more diversified program. So yeah, there's obviously some advantages not to put all low-income kids all together, and we move in that direction, let's put it that way. As far as New York City goes, and this is a problem, The one thing, with enough funding, the scholarships would go beyond, say, 185% of poverty or below. We can go up to 300 to 400%, and we do partial scholarships, mean tested. So we mitigate to some extent the problem of what's happening to lower middle class families as the cost and other issues come up with early childhood programs. So I think New York's looking at that right now, but it takes money. I mean, that's the bottom line. It takes money.
Just a quick comment.
Oh, do you want just one of us to answer?
Just a quick comment.
I mean, it's a critically important question, and the one thing I would say that could be a one-sentence answer is we have to start becoming more precise in our thinking about what it is we're trying to achieve and what it is we're doing in all these programs, because there are so many agendas to address. And we have a legacy of a field that says, well, the more problems or the more challenges we have, the more comprehensive our approach needs to be, which is a synonym to most policymakers for expensive. And then we measure everything we can think of measuring, and then we argue about what the results mean. And so there's a need for greater precision. What are the goals we're trying to achieve? Are they academic? Are they behavioral? Are they social goals? Are they political goals? All of which could be equally important, but by not being precise about that, we end up with these food fights we have most of the time and can't answer the question of how can we make what we're doing better and more effective.
Excellent. I'll take the question in the back. Please announce yourself.
Hi, my name is Karen Heck, and I work for a foundation in Maine that has been active for the last 10 years on early childhood. In fact, Dr. Shonkoff came and addressed 400 businessmen and women 8 or 10 years ago. We then had an election that is a precursor to what we're going through nationally. Our governor, LePage, believes that he was Trump before Trump was Trump. And and I wish it was funny, but we're the only state with a rising infant mortality rate. And so my concern is, first, we can't do this without government. The foundations that we have in early childhood funders group has put millions of dollars into actually holding the wall right now and moving it forward. But we have a governor, and now we have a lot of political thinking that, first of all, government is not the answer to anything. Private industry is, and of course that means privatization of prisons, which is a pipeline that they're going to want to fill. And we have a very close-knit and well-tuned lobby organization that's moving things in Maine, but I worry about us being distracted nationally, and the fact that now, because business people are in charge of government, like our governor is, that short-term returns are what matters. And that, combined with the fact that facts don't matter, while I want to be so excited, and I am so excited about the opportunity to develop strong children from the get-go, I am imploring you all to think about how we really change this conversation from parents are the ones who should deal with kids and they should do it on their own because government doesn't have a place, to one where it's not socialist to think that by supporting those people across this political and economic spectrum, it's not socialist to do that. It's in our own best human capital interest. So any thoughts?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I've learned in this space is that it's hard to put people in buckets. And so I've given talks in rural Wisconsin, which is not so different than rural Maine. I have a sister that lives there. And what I found is that often the business community can be a strong supporter for early childhood investment. They understand that their workers, they have trouble finding workers when there isn't quality childcare available. And they understand that they can't find the people that they need coming out of the college system unless unless skills are increased. And so, I think often those unusual bedfellows can make the strongest case for the investment and the importance of that to people who are maybe less interested in hearing it. That's what I would say.
We also have developed a very strong business. We've also developed a very strong business community, but it's still lower on the spectrum, and nationally is my concern because it's so low.
Just a quick one.
So we need a new narrative here. I think the science is so over. This is the ultimate big tent issue, right? So we have to change the narrative from not arguing about is it government responsibility, private sector responsibility, community responsibility. We need to kind of we need to mobilize the knowledge that's really clear that early experiences really do get into your body. And I will tell you, not only in terms of the science, but we did work in South Carolina where people embraced that because they saw that as proof of intelligent design, that early experiences would actually affect your brain. So if we could get everybody on board for the knowledge base and then get the early childhood community, which is living in a different world now and needs to stop saying we know exactly what to do, all we need is more money. If everybody would kind of come to a new shared narrative about the fact that the evidence for the importance of this is overwhelming, we have a very strong base to begin with and a lot that we know, and we've got a long way to go, and we can't leave it up to either the government, the private sector, or communities alone to do it. And we all have a vested interest because the major return comes to society, not to the individuals. The narrative has to change because we suck up a lot of oxygen fighting about things that are 20th century battles that we should be having a different conversation.
All right, just really quick.
There's a national organization called Ready Nation, and they have organized hundreds of CEOs and military people from around the country. They're actually going international, promoting exactly what Jack is saying, based on the science. So there is a national organization moving in this direction, and I think that's what we need if we're going to really make the difference.
So as I go to the next question in the back, I might be asked those who are lined up if they could just quickly ask their questions as a collective, and then I can let the group respond so we can manage our time as efficiently as possible. I appreciate that. So please announce yourself.
Erica Vixilio from Charlottesville, Virginia, and I lead an early education task force to place all at-risk 4-year-olds in high-quality preschool. And my question is about the Minnesota model, how you secured the initial $20 million private investment, and if any of those funders are still involved, and then how did you transition to the government support and get an increased amount as you've gone forward?
Excellent. So that's for Art. We'll hold for that one. The next one.
Hi, I'm Lauren Hogan. I'm the Senior Director for Public Policy at the National Association for Education of Young Children. And as one of those people who spends a lot of time asking for more money for what we need, I guess one of the things that we've been struggling with is, we know we need money to invest to achieve high quality. We underinvest. Then the results come out and they say they didn't meet what we said we are going to achieve. And rather than using that as an opportunity to say, okay, what we need to do is invest more, we take that as an excuse to then say this doesn't work and we're going to invest less. What's the research, the joint research advocacy response that we can help develop that says, that responds and breaks that trajectory that we find ourselves on right now?
Excellent. We'll hold that one, and then we'll take this last question here.
Okay, Sherry Rolnick from Minnesota. I want to thank you all for your remarks, and as Art mentioned, I'm an epidemiologist, so I come from a health background. And I was very excited when I heard that the Association of Pediatricians actually came out with a policy statement urging early childhood education for at-risk families. My question to anybody that knows, what's happening with the OBGYN community? Clearly you want to identify these people earlier, and the more people singing the song, the better.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'll turn to the panel to respond.
On the Minnesota, let me just say this. Minnesota's a good example where the business community, I know they have the reputation of looking short-term, not our CEOs, when it's General Mills or Ecolab or Cargill or Target, they have long-term visions for their company and their community. They're the ones that made the initial pilot happen. That $20 million came from mostly from those companies and a few others around. And they continue to be very engaged. If they weren't very engaged, we wouldn't be able to scale it up. And because they've been politically active, and these are CEOs that have become state spokespeople from around the state, and they're now spokespeople nationally on this issue. So my view of it is, at least in our community, it was critical to get the business community involved, and that's where that money came from.
So I guess I need to speak to the OBGYN question.
I knew that was angling towards
So
you.
let me say, it's just an extension of our strategy for pediatrics, because notwithstanding the American Academy of Pediatrics statement, it's not as if the kind of the medical establishment has risen up on this. My own humble opinion here is that the way to get to the medical establishment is to kind of go right to the heart of the beast and present this as an issue of not capitalizing on the revolution in the underlying science of medicine. You know, I think a lot of people understand here about how the treatment of disease is being transformed by a precision medicine approach that is not only going to be more effective, but it's going to be more expensive. And the same principles that are driving precision medicine to treat disease, the same scientific principles, could be used to understand how to address the social determinants of health early in life. So I think the OBGYN community is not going to come on board as a social justice issue, but it might come on board as a science issue, which is, I think, true for the whole medical world. That's kind of my own opinion.
AG,
Yep.
there was one question on what happens when you do this and you don't spend enough money and you don't get enough results. My advice to most communities is start small. Work with a few hundred kids, do it really well, do it very high quality, so you don't run into this problem. And essentially, that's what we did in St. Paul. We started small, we made it very high quality. We were paying up to $13,000 a year for scholarships. We were getting home visiting nurses when we could into these families. So we had what we thought the best science, paid well, and got some really good results. That avoids the problem that the questionnaire asked.
So in case this is being taped or somebody's tweeting, there are people in OBGYN who understand this. And are doing it. They're fighting an uphill battle, but there are people who understand this. So have hope.
I want to make one last comment. That goes back to the comment about how do you move the field forward even if you don't get the exact results you need. I think, as Jack says and has said before, we need to be willing to be in partnership with our critics, which means stopping the siege mentality and having lengthy conversations about what any one particular finding means and doesn't mean. And that can be hard because it doesn't mean, but I think, it doesn't mean ceding ground. It means recognizing that there's a lot to be learned from the evidence, and there's rarely a, bullet conclusion that can be made that it's not working at all or not serving families at all. So I think it's really important to think about partnerships and creating organizations that are learning from what they find, rather than battling to, hold ground or lose ground.
So this has been a wonderful discussion, but I want to do one quick thing here. So Arsenio Hall, if y'all remember, had this thing called the Arsenio Hall moment, right? We have 3 questions in the back. We can't answer them now because we're out of time. But here's what I would like for you to do. Ask your question so it gives us an opportunity to go, So with that being said, please.
Okay, very quickly, Francisca Richter from Cleveland. My question is, are the children in the quality voucher program being followed to adolescence to see if the maybe less quality options available during the school years to high school have also an impact? And I mean, that's a problem for our kids in Cleveland and all, cities like Detroit. We're replicating a program from Detroit that has been very successful at that, for that second window of opportunity. I just want to see if those kids are being tracked and what solutions at that level can help, maybe the trauma-sensitive school approach, to keep those improvements from early childhood going till they graduate from high school. Thanks.
Thank you. Next, please.
Hi, I'm James Gatz with the Treasury Department, and I just wanted to ask you to help connect the dots between what you're saying, which is awesome and interesting and important, but connect the dots between our existing system in this country. We've had Head Start for 50 years or more, 52 years, early Head Start. Are you saying use Head Start? Are you saying use something else? It doesn't sound like you're using Head Start Minnesota. Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Stephen Drillis, New Jersey Coalition for Financial Education. Competition, parental decision. bases private schools, charter schools, and public schools, and now there's competition. How do you feel about that?
Thank you so much. That is the conclusion of our panel. But if you love what you heard today, first of all, let's give a round of applause to Rob for thinking about it and bringing us all together. Let's truly applaud this incredible panel. Did you not learn something? And that was overwhelming. I don't know about you, but it was overwhelming for me. So I'm looking forward to sitting down and having some tea and talking further about this. With that being said, thank you all so much. Looking forward to a wonderful rest of our conference.